I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the NFL protests that have been going on for the last year and a half and how they relate to the First Amendment and what we can learn about the First Amendment from thinking about those. So just for a little bit of background, this has been a pretty highly covered subject in the press, and a lot of people are aware of it, and obviously it deals with the NFL, which is the most popular sport in the country. So it's a fun and interesting way to get into some important parts of the First Amendment. But back in 2016, a guy named Colin Kaepernick, who was the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers at the time, began kneeling during the National Anthem, which is played before the beginning of every NFL game, actually by league rule. And we could talk about the history of why the National Anthem is involved in sports at all, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this. But it's been there for 100 years or more, and for at least the last decade, it's been part of the NFL's official rule book. So Colin Kaepernick began kneeling during the National Anthem while it was played at the beginning of the game. And when asked by reporters who eventually noticed he was doing this, why he was doing this, he explained that it was because he believed that there was systemic racism and injustice and unfairness in the criminal justice system in America, and his kneeling was his way of protesting what he saw as an unfair system. And it didn't generate a lot of attention at first, but over time, more and more players started to catch on. It's a league that is predominantly black, and a lot of players have had experience with the criminal justice system, or their families have in the past, and feel very strongly about the issue. And more players started kneeling before games until it eventually became a major national story and sort of sparked debate both about the issue that the players were talking about, which was injustice in the criminal justice system, and also sort of sparked a counter debate amongst people who saw what they were doing as disrespectful to the flag, disrespectful to the country, disrespectful to troops, and other sort of they saw it as anti-patriotic. And so this sort of just escalated and escalated, and during the 2017 season, Donald Trump felt the need to get involved and made a number of statements throughout the season expressing his opinion of what the NFL players were doing. He was not in favor of it. He thought it was terrible. He called them lots of names, which I won't say on this particular video, unless we want to get an R rating. He made statements that the players that participated in these protests should be fined, should be suspended, and in true Trump fashion, should be fired from their teams. And he even went as far as to threaten government action against the NFL itself if it didn't take action to stop the protests. So that went on and was a huge story throughout all of the 2017 NFL season. After the season, during the offseason, the owners of the teams and the league all got together and created a new policy for what the players could and couldn't do during the National Anthem. And in short, what the policy says is that if you're on the field, you have to stand. But if you don't want to stand for the anthem, you can stay in the locker room. And so obviously this was the NFL's attempt to sort of please everybody, and predictably, in particular to anybody that sort of followed the NFL's mishandling of various controversies over the years, it ended up just pissing everybody off more. And nobody was happy about it. So that's sort of the backstory. And I will set aside, for the purposes of this video, any value judgment as to who may or may not be right about what they're expressing with respect to these protests. But I will say that it's a great example and an interesting example for learning about the First Amendment, and shows a couple of really interesting concepts that there's a couple of really interesting First Amendment concepts that we can learn through looking at this. So the very first thing, and sort of one of the most fundamental and often misunderstood aspects of the First Amendment, is that it only applies to public, meaning governmental actors, as opposed to private actors, meaning non-governmental people that aren't involved in politics or administrating the government. And at the most basic level, if you read the First Amendment, it's not a rule about what people are allowed to do. It's a rule about what the government is not allowed to do. And what it says is, and I'm abridging it a little bit, but it says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. It doesn't say people are free to say what they want or anything like that. It's just about what the government is allowed to do or allowed to stop people from doing. And so in practice, what that means is that the government can't make rules about speech that it doesn't agree with. It can't stop you from saying things that it doesn't agree with. But private individuals and private institutions, like, for example, companies is the major example in our modern society, can make rules like that. And private actors, like companies or others, can punish people, like employees, if they break those rules. And that's a very, very common thing. That may sound strange to hear, but it happens all the time. And if you think about some of the news stories you read every day, this is absolutely a common thing. For example, there was a big story a few months ago, or maybe last year, about an engineer working at Google who had published a manifesto as to why he thought men were better coders than women, and he said it was because of biological reasons and various things like that. And he was fired, specifically for writing this and disseminating this. And this was just his opinion, right? And regardless of whether you agree with him or disagree with him, some people would think, well, doesn't he have a First Amendment right to say that without fear of being punished? And the answer is no, because it's not the government punishing him, it's his employer. And an employer has the right to set the rules by which people that are employed by them conduct themselves. And if people break those rules, they have the right to fire those people or to take other action against them. And this is very common in sports as well, which are typically thought of as private enterprises and private businesses. Most sports leagues have rules that say that the players have to meet with the media after the game and talk with the media. And if they don't, they can be fined or suspended or otherwise punished. Most, if not all, sports leagues have codes of conduct, which give them the right to fine or suspend or otherwise punish players that don't act in a way that the league thinks is good, whether that's through speech or action or anything else. So this is very common in the world, in the private world as opposed to the public world. And whenever this is sort of the starting point for thinking about whether a rule is a violation of the First Amendment, if it's a government rule, then you know that you're in the world of things that are protected by the First Amendment. And if it's a private rule, then typically you'd be outside of that realm, and you're not going to be able to rely on the First Amendment to allow you to do what you want. That sounds very simple. In reality, it's not always so easy to understand whether somebody that makes a rule is a private actor or a public actor. And actually, the NFL protests are a really great example of that. So I said a minute ago that sports leagues and sports teams are typically thought of as private businesses, and in many ways they are. They have private owners, they're sort of for-profit, they make money, they charge prices, they're on TV, all that kind of stuff. But there are also aspects of professional sports, and I'll talk about the NFL in particular, but it's sort of across the board, that make it not so clear that they might always be just a simple private business. For example, many teams play in stadiums that are owned by local governmental entities. And so you have to ask yourself the question, well, is the fact that they are playing in this public space, right? Does that mean that they are able to make the rules for what is able to happen in that public space? And it's not always so obvious that the answer is yes. Similarly, even where stadiums are not, even where the teams own the stadiums, they're often funded by taxpayers. Another thing that's commonly in the press and often very controversial, should we be spending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money to pay some rich sports owner, to buy him a new stadium. And I won't opine on whether that's a good thing or not, but I will say that it at least raises the question of, well, if you're playing in a stadium that we, the taxpayers, paid for, shouldn't that be considered, or could that be considered that you're sort of more in the governmental realm than in the private realm? And you can have whatever opinion you want on that, and you can think about, should they, the same issues would apply not just to the players' conduct, but maybe to the fans' conduct. So should the teams be allowed to make rules about what the fans can and cannot say when they're at a stadium? And the first question you have to answer in getting into that is, well, are the teams acting as governmental actors, or are they purely private? And it's a little bit, there's no clear answer here, and I'm not suggesting that there is. And when courts have looked at these kinds of issues, which they have done, typically it's very fact dependent. It depends on the circumstances, it depends on the rule, it depends on the team, it depends on the place. So that's one way it can be complicated. Another way it can be complicated is, I described earlier how sort of while this controversy was all getting started, Donald Trump, who obviously represents the government, saw fit to wade into it and express his opinion, and even go so far as to threaten the leagues, with what he specifically said was that he would take away some unspecified tax breaks from the NFL if they didn't, punish the players sufficiently. And that raises the question of, well, if a private business does something, but it's only doing it because the government told it to, or forced it to, or wants it to, does that then make it a governmental actor such that First Amendment protections should apply? And again, I don't think there's an easy answer here. It's very fact-specific and situationally dependent, but it at least raises the question of whether, in this context, in the context of NFL players protesting during the National Anthem, should they be afforded protection under the First Amendment because the NFL is close enough to a governmental actor, or because the NFL is only doing things because Trump told them to, that they should be protected? Or should this be treated like the Google scenario, where we're going to say, look, we may not agree with it, but they certainly have the right to do it? Whenever you think about action taken against speech, or action taken to stop somebody from speaking, you have to think about who is doing the stopping and whether they're public or private, and that's not always such an easy question to answer.